The halls of St. Jude's Trauma Center were reserved for the elite Ivy League doctors and nurses with egos as big as their paychecks. When Sarah walked in, wearing scrubs that looked 2 sizes too big and a silence that unsettled the room, they didn't just ignore her. They laughed. They called her the mute, the maid, and the liability. They tried to force her out, but they didn't know who she really was. They didn't know that the scars on her arms weren't from clumsiness, but from shrapnel. They didn't know that their most high-value patient, a dying Navy SEAL commander, was holding on for one reason only. And it wasn't for the doctors. The laughter in the break room of Ward 4 West wasn't subtle. It was the sharp, jagged kind that was meant to be heard through the thin drywall. I asked her for a clamp, and she handed me a hemostat. Dr. Julian Thorne scoffed, leaning back in his leather chair. He was the golden boy of St. Jude's, a trauma surgeon whose Instagram following rivaled his surgical success rate. I swear HR is scraping the bottom of the barrel. She looks like she wandered in from a bus stop. She's 45 if she's a day. Nurse Jessica Thorne's head, surgical nurse, chimed in, stirring her oat milk latte. Who starts their residency or nursing rotation at 45, and have you seen her hands? They shake. I saw her trembling when she was prepping the IV tray for Mrs. Gable. Probably the DTs, Thorne muttered, checking his watch. Alcoholic or burned out. Either way, get her out of my OR. If she touches a patient during a critical procedure, I'm filing a formal complaint against administration. Outside the door, Sarah Mitchell adjusted the collar of her scrub top. It was blue standard issue, but on her it hung loosely, hiding a frame that was wiry and hardened. She had heard every word. She didn't blink. She didn't storm in to defend herself. She simply picked up the tray of sterilized instruments she had been carrying and walked toward the nurse's station. Sarah had been at St. Jude's for 3 weeks. In that time, she had spoken less than 100 words. She did the grunt work, changing bedpans, sanitizing surfaces, restocking carts, tasks that the younger, elite nurses felt were beneath them. She took the graveyard shifts nobody wanted. She took the ridicule. "Hey, newbie." Sarah paused. It was Greg, a second-year resident with a smirk permanently etched onto his face. He tossed a dirty lab coat at her. It landed on her shoulder. "Take that to laundry, and grab me a coffee. Black. Don't mess it up like you did the charts." Sarah slowly peeled the coat off her shoulder. She looked at Greg. For a split second, her eyes, usually a dull, passive gray, flashed with something sodden metallic. It was the look of someone who had decided whether a man lived or died in the time it took to blink. Greg faltered his smirk, slipping for a fraction of a second. "Coffee," Sarah said softly. Her voice was raspy, like gravel moving over velvet. "Yeah. Coffee," Greg stammered, regaining his composure as she walked away. "Freak." The truth was, Sarah's hands did shake. But not from alcohol. They shook from the phantom vibrations of Black Hawk rotors. They shook because for 20 years her hands had been covered in the blood of boys who cried out for their mothers in the dirt of Kandahar Fallujah and places the government wouldn't admit existed. She wasn't just a new nurse. She was former Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, call sign Angel, a specialized pararescue jumper and combat medic attached to Tier 1 Special Operations units. She had retired 3 years ago after an IED took out half her convoy and left her with a TBI, traumatic brain injury, and a spine full of titanium. She had come to St. Jude's not for the money, but because she needed the noise. The silence of retirement was too loud. She needed the beeping of monitors to sleep. She needed to be useful. But she had promised herself no heroics, no combat, just quiet care. She was failing at the quiet part, mostly because Dr. Thorne and his clique were making her life a living hell. That afternoon, the hospital PA system crackled to life. The tone was different. 3 sharp blasts. Code Black. Trauma Bay 1. ETA, 3 minutes. Mass casualty event reported. High-value transfer incoming. The break room emptied instantly. Dr. Thorne was already barking orders as he sprinted down the hall. Jessica, prep or 1. Greg, get the blood bank on the line. This is it, people. We have VIPs coming in from the airfield. Sarah stood by the linen cart. She wasn't assigned to Trauma Bay 1. She was assigned to mop-up duty. But as the sirens wailed closer, a sound cut through the sterile air that made her blood freeze. It was the distinct rhythmic thumping of a heavy-lift military helicopter landing on the roof. Sarah dropped the mop. She knew that sound. That wasn't a medevac chopper. That was a PAVE Hawk. Something had gone wrong. Badly wrong. The trauma bay was chaos. The doors burst open, and paramedics, accompanied by 2 massive men in plain clothes wearing tactical headsets, wheeled in a stretcher. The patient was a mess of wires, blood-soaked gauze, and shattered bone. Male 40s, multiple gunshot wounds to the thoracic cavity. The lead paramedic shouted, his voice cracking. BP is 60/40 and dropping. We lost his pulse twice in the bird. Dr. Thorne stepped up, his ego swelling to fill the room. I've got this. Clear the way. Get a line in him. Type and cross-match for ONEG stat. The men in the tactical gear hovered aggressively. One of them, a bearded giant with a scar running down his neck, grabbed Thorne's scrub sleeve. Doc, the man growled. You listen to me. This is Commander Hayes. You lose him and there is no hole deep enough for you to hide in. Thorne yanked his arm away. Get these men out of my OR. I am trying to save a life here. Security ushered the operators out, but the tension remained thick enough to choke on. On the table, Commander Marcus Breaker Hayes was fading. The monitor screamed a flat, dissonant tone. He's coding! Nurse Jessica screamed. Fib. Paddles! Thorne yelled. Charge to 200. Thump. Nothing. Charge to 300. Thump. Come on. Thorne was sweating now. The confident surgeon was cracking. The damage was too extensive. There was arterial spray hitting the floor every time they did compressions. Where is the bleeder? I can't see anything through this mess. In the corner of the room, unnoticed, Sarah Mitchell had slipped in. She wasn't supposed to be there. She was supposed to be cleaning the waiting room. But she was watching the monitor, and she was watching the blood flow. She saw what Thorne missed. Thorne was looking at the chest wounds. But the blood wasn't pooling in the chest cavity alone. The commander's abdomen was distended tight as a drum. He's got a junctional hemorrhage, Sarah whispered. No one heard her. I said charge to 360, Thorne screamed. We are losing him. Sarah moved. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was muscle memory. She stepped past Greg, who tried to block her. Get out of here, janitor, Greg hissed. Sarah shoved him. It wasn't a gentle push. She drove her shoulder into his sternum with enough force to knock the breath out of him, sending him stumbling into a cart. Hey! Thorne looked up, eyes wide with rage. What the hell are you doing, security? Sarah ignored him. She reached the table. She didn't look at Thorne. She looked at the wound on the commander's upper thigh, high up near the groin, hidden by the shredded tactical pants. It was a femoral artery, Nick bleeding internally disguised by the chest trauma. "He's bleeding out from the femoral," Sarah said, her voice commanding, dropping an octave into her command voice, the voice that had directed fire teams under mortar attack. "Stop compressions. You're pumping the blood out of him." "You are fired," Thorne roared. "Get away from the patient." Sarah didn't flinch. She jammed her fist, literally, her entire gloved fist deep into the open wound on the commander's groin. It was a brutal, archaic maneuver. The room went silent. "I said stop compressions." Sarah stared Thorne dead in the eyes. "Look at the monitor." Thorne looked. The blood pressure, which had been flatlining, gave a small, weak blip. Then another. The massive arterial spray that had been coating the floor slowed to a trickle. By applying direct manual pressure to the artery against the pelvic bone, she had crimped the hose. He stabilized," Jessica whispered, staring at the screen. Sarah didn't smile. She was sweating, her face pale, her hands shaking slightly from the exertion, but her grip was iron. "Clamp," Sarah said. She didn't ask. She ordered. Thorne stood frozen. His brain couldn't process what was happening. The janitor nurse, the one he mocked for trembling hands, was currently elbow-deep in a Navy SEAL, holding his life together with sheer brute force. "I said give me a damn vascular clamp, doctor," Sarah barked. Thorne snapped out of it. He grabbed the instrument and handed it to her. With a dexterity that belied her earlier shaking, Sarah navigated the blood-slicked cavity, found the torn artery, and clamped it blind. She slowly withdrew her hand. The monitor held steady. "Now," Sarah said, peeling off her blood-soaked gloves and tossing them into the bin. "You can treat the chest wounds. He won't bleed out while you do it." She turned to walk away. "Wait," Thorne stammered. "How did you... Who are you?" Sarah paused at the door. The adrenaline was fading, and the familiar ache in her spine was returning. She looked at the floor. "Just the new nurse," she said quietly. She walked out. But as she left, the doors to the trauma bay swung open again. The two operators from before the one's security had kicked out were standing there. They had seen the last 30 seconds through the observation glass. The giant with the beard stared at Sarah as she walked past. His eyes went wide. He looked at her face, then at the way she walked, favoring her left leg slightly. "Angel," the operator whispered. Sarah didn't stop. She kept walking until she reached the locker room, where she sat on a bench and buried her face in her hands. She had broken cover. She had broken protocol. And she had definitely just gotten herself fired. Inside the trauma bay, Commander Hayes's vitals were stabilizing. But the drama was far from over. Thorne was already spinning the narrative in his head. "I saved him. I directed the nurse. It was my team." He had no idea that the man on the table was waking up, and he certainly had no idea that Commander Hayes owed Sarah Mitchell a debt that couldn't be paid with money. The adrenaline had long since evaporated, leaving Dr. Julian Thorne with a calculated coolness. He stood in the office of Hospital Administrator Marcus Sterling, a man whose concern for the hospital's endowment fund far outweighed his concern for patient care. "She assaulted a resident, Marcus," Thorne said, smoothing his pristine white coat. "She physically shoved Dr. Greg Evans, and then she shoved her unwashed hands into a sterile surgical cavity. It's a miracle Commander Hayes didn't go into septic shock immediately. I had to intervene, repair the damage she caused, and stabilize the patient myself." Administrator Sterling tapped his pen on the mahogany desk. "But the patient is alive, because of me," Thorne lied without blinking. I guided the team. She was a disruption. A dangerous, unhinged disruption. I want her license revoked, and I want her gone. If the Navy finds out a geriatric, shaky-handed nurse was manhandling a SEAL commander, we'll lose the military contract. Sterling nodded slowly. You're right. We can't risk the liability. Draft the termination papers. I'll have security escort her out before the shift change. While the administration plotted her demise, Sarah was down in the sterilization room scrubbing instruments. The water was scalding hot, turning her hands raw and red, but she didn't feel it. She was lost in a memory, a dust storm in the Argan Dab Valley. The smell of burning diesel and the weight of a dying boy in her arms. She knew she was done. She knew Thorne would spin it. In the civilian world, results didn't matter as much as protocol. In her old life, if you saved the hostage, you were a hero. Here, if you saved the patient, but didn't fill out the right form, you were a liability. Up in the ICU, the atmosphere was heavy. Commander Marcus Breaker Hayes was awake though heavily sedated. He was a man carved from granite, with eyes that had seen too much darkness to ever truly close. His team, the operators who had brought him in, were standing guard. They refused to leave the room, despite the nurses' protests. Unit integrity, the bearded giant, whom the others called Dutch, growled at a terrified nurse. We don't break it. Dr. Thorne breezed into the room, a practiced smile plastered on his face. He held a clipboard. Gentlemen. Thorne nodded to the operators, then turned to the bed. Commander, good to see you with us. That was a close call. Touch and go, but I managed to clamp the femoral just in time. You're a lucky man. Hayes blinked, his vision clearing. He looked at Thorne. He looked at the surgeon's soft, manicured hands. You, Hayes rasped. His voice sounded like grinding stones. Yes, Thorne beamed. I'm Dr. Thorne, Chief of Trauma Surgery. I led the team. Hayes frowned. The memory was fragmented flashes of white light and searing pain. But he remembered a sensation. A grip. It hadn't been the tentative, probing touch of a surgeon afraid to break something. It had been a violent, decisive intrusion that hurt like hell, but stopped the cold feeling of death spreading in his legs. And he remembered a voice. Not this man's smooth baritone. A woman's voice. Raspy. Smoky. Commanding. There was a woman, Hayes whispered. Thorne's smile didn't waver, but his eyes tightened. Ah yes, the nurses. They were assisting me. Standard procedure. No, Hayes said, struggling to sit up before the pain forced him back. Not a nurse. A soldier. Thorne laughed lightly, a condescending sound. The anesthesia plays tricks on the mind, Commander. There are no soldiers on my medical staff, just highly trained doctors. Now rest. You need your strength. Thorne turned to leave, signaling the nurses to increase the sedative. But as he walked past, Dutch, the giant operator, stepped into his path. Dutch was 6'5" and built like a tank. Doc, Dutch said. Yes. Thorne looked annoyed. Who was the woman with the grey eyes, the one who walked out? Thorne scoffed. A nobody, a temp nurse. She's being terminated as we speak for incompetence. Don't worry, she won't be anywhere near the commander again. Thorne walked out, feeling triumphant. Dutch watched him go. Then he looked back at Hayes. The commander's eyes were open, and the fog was clearing. Dutch, Hayes whispered. I'm here, boss. He's lying, Hayes said. Find her. Sarah sat in the small, windowless office of Human Resources. Across from her sat a woman named Karen, who looked more bored than angry. Ms. Mitchell. Karen sighed, sliding a piece of paper across the desk. Dr. Thorne has filed a formal incident report. Insubordination. Physical assault on a resident and practicing outside the scope of your nursing license. We have no choice but to terminate your employment, effective immediately. Sarah looked at the paper. Termination. She didn't argue. She didn't explain that Thorne had been freezing up or that the resident had been in the way. She simply nodded. Okay, Sarah said softly. Please hand over your badge, Karen said. Sarah unclipped the plastic ID from her scrub top and placed it on the desk. It felt lighter. You have 20 minutes to clear out your locker. Security will escort you to the exit. Sarah stood up. Her back ached. The old shrapnel wound in her hip was throbbing a reminder that it was going to rain soon. She walked out of the office, flanked by 2 security guards, who looked at her like she was a criminal. They marched her through the main hallway. It was the shift change. The hallway was crowded with doctors, nurses, and residents. They all stopped to watch. News travels fast in a hospital. Everyone knew. The weird mute nurse had finally snapped and gotten fired. Good riddance, Greg, the resident she had shoved, sneered as she passed. He was holding an ice pack to his chest. Hope you enjoy flipping burgers. Nurse Jessica was there too, shaking her head. I told you she wasn't cut out for this. Too unstable. Sarah kept her eyes forward. She carried a small cardboard box containing a stethoscope, a spare pair of socks, and a framed photo of a dog that had passed away years ago. That was it. That was her whole life at St. Jude's. She reached the lobby. The automatic doors were just ahead. Freedom. Silence. Hold it. The shout was so loud it rattled the glass in the reception booth. The security guards stopped. Sarah stopped. Down the long corridor coming from the elevators was a phalanx of men. It was Dutch and 3 other operators. They weren't walking. They were moving with a purpose that made the doctors and visitors scramble out of the way. Dutch spotted Sarah. He pointed a finger at her. You, Dutch bellowed. Don't move. The security guards put their hands on their belts. They didn't carry guns, just tasers. Sir, you can't be down here. This is a restricted... Dutch didn't even look at the guard. He just kept walking until he was standing 2 feet from Sarah. He towered over her. The hallway went dead silent. Everyone was watching. Was she in trouble? Had she hurt the patient? Was this the military police coming to arrest her? Greg smirked. Oh, this is going to be good. They're going to arrest her. Dutch looked down at Sarah. He looked at the cardboard box in her hands. Then he looked at her face, studying the scar above her eyebrow. The grey eyes, the way she stood with her weight distributed evenly, ready to move. Ma'am, Dutch said, his voice surprisingly gentle for a man of his size. Commander Hayes is asking for you. Sarah tightened her grip on the box. I don't work here anymore. I was just fired. Dutch's head snapped up. He looked around the lobby, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on Dr. Thorne, who had just come down to enjoy the show. Fired. Dutch repeated the word, heavy with menace. She nearly killed the patient, Thorne shouted from the back, trying to regain control of the narrative. She is a danger to this hospital. Officers, remove her. Dutch turned his body slowly toward Thorne. The other 3 operators fanned out, creating a protective perimeter around Sarah. It was a subtle tactical move, diamond formation used to protect a VIP. Nearly killed him? Dutch asked, his voice low. That man up there is alive because someone knew how to crimp a femoral artery without seeing it. And I know for a fact, Doctor, that it wasn't you. I saw the security footage from the bay. A gasp went through the lobby. That's confidential property. Thorne sputtered, his face turning red. It's evidence, Dutch corrected. And I saw a woman with a distinct limp and a left-handed clamp technique save my CO's life while you were screaming for electricity. Dutch turned back to Sarah. He saw the way she was looking at the floor, trying to disappear. He saw the shame she shouldn't be feeling. We checked your file, ma'am, Dutch said softly, so only she could hear. Or the file you gave HR. Sarah Mitchell, associate's degree in nursing, previous experience nursing home. Sarah didn't look up. But then I made a call to a friend at the Pentagon, Dutch continued. I gave him your vitals and your description, and he told me there is no Sarah Mitchell. Sarah's eyes snapped to his. He told me. Dutch smiled a sad, respectful smile. That there is a Jane Doe, retired from the 24th Special Tactics Squadron, call sign Angel. The only woman to ever complete the PJ pipeline and serve with the teams off the books, credited with 400 combat saves. The box slipped from Sarah's hands. It hit the floor with a thud. The whisper ran through the crowd. Special Tactics. 400 saves. Thorne pushed his way to the front. I don't care if she's Florence Nightingale. She broke protocol. She is fired. She isn't going anywhere. A voice boomed from the elevators. The crowd parted. A wheelchair was being pushed forward by a terrified nurse. In it sat Commander Hayes. He was pale, hooked up to a portable IV and a monitor, and he looked like death warmed over. But he was sitting upright. Commander, you cannot be out of bed, Thorne shrieked. Hayes ignored him. He looked across the lobby at Sarah. Their eyes locked. For the first time in years, Sarah felt seen. Not as a janitor, not as a screw-up, but as who she was. Hayes raised a trembling hand. He didn't point. He slowly, painfully brought his hand up to his brow. He saluted her. Dutch and the three other operators snapped to attention. Their boots slammed into the linoleum floor in unison. Crack. They raised their hands in a sharp, crisp salute. The silence in the lobby was deafening. Lieutenant, Hayes rasped, using her old rank. I believe you have my life in your hands. Again. Sarah's lip trembled. She fought it, but a single tear tracked through the dust on her cheek. She slowly straightened her posture. The slouch of the tired nurse vanished. Her shoulders squared, her chin rose. She returned the salute. Commander, she whispered. Thorne looked around, realizing the tide had turned violently against him. This is ridiculous. This is a hospital, not a parade ground. Security. Shut up, Administrator Sterling said. He had appeared on the balcony overlooking the lobby. He had been watching the whole thing. He looked down at Thorne. Shut up, Julian. Sterling walked down the stairs. He approached Sarah. He looked at the operators, then at the commander, and finally at the new nurse he had just ordered fired. Ms. Mitchell, Sterling said, his voice shaking slightly. It seems there has been a significant misunderstanding regarding your employment status. No misunderstanding, Sarah said, her voice regaining that steel from the trauma bay. She looked at Thorne. I quit. No, Hayes said from the wheelchair. You don't. He rolled his wheelchair forward until he was right in front of her. I have a mission for you, Angel, Hayes said, and it pays better than this place. But before Sarah could answer, the hospital doors blew open again. But this time, it wasn't a patient. It was a man in a black suit holding a briefcase, followed by 2 state troopers. "Dr. Julian Thorne," the man in the suit asked. Thorne blinked. "I am Dr. Thorne." "I'm from the Medical Ethics Board," the man said. "We just received a digital packet containing security footage of Trauma Bay 1, along with audio logs of you falsifying patient records." Thorne went pale. He looked at Dutch. Dutch held up his phone and winked. "You're suspended pending an immediate investigation," the man in the suit said. "Troopers, please escort the doctor off the premises." As Thorne was dragged away, kicking and screaming about his reputation, the lobby erupted into applause. Not for Thorne. They were clapping for Sarah. But the story wasn't over. Because the mission Hayes had mentioned wasn't just a job offer. It was a warning. The people who had shot Hayes were still out there, and they knew he was at St. Jude's. The hospital wasn't safe anymore. The applause in the lobby died down as quickly as it had started, replaced by a cold, vibrating tension. Commander Hayes didn't smile. He grabbed Sarah's wrist, his grip surprisingly strong for a man who had flatlined an hour ago. "Angel." Hayes whispered, his voice low enough that only she and Dutch could hear. "They didn't just ambush us. They hunted us. It's the menacing shadow organization known as Blackwell. They know I have the encryption key. They know I'm here. And they don't leave loose ends." Sarah's eyes narrowed. Blackwell. A rogue private military contractor that operated outside the law, ruthless, efficient, and heavily armed. If Blackwell was coming hospital security, wouldn't stand a chance. "How long do we have?" Sarah asked, her voice shifting seamlessly back to the tactical cadence of a lieutenant. "They hit the convoy at 1400. Dutch checked his watch. "They'll track the medevac bird. They know we're stationary. I'd say we have less than 20 minutes before the first scout team breaches." Sarah turned to the stunned crowd of doctors and nurses. Administrator Sterling was still standing there looking confused. Greg and Jessica were staring at Sarah like she was an alien. "Listen to me," Sarah shouted. The rasp in her voice was gone, replaced by pure command presence. "We are locking down this hospital. This is no longer a medical facility. It is a defensive hard point. You can't just—" Sterling started to protest. "If you want to live, you will do exactly what I say." Sarah cut him off. She turned to Dutch. "Dutch, take your team and secure the ground floor entrances. Use the vending machines and heavy furniture to barricade the glass doors. Nothing gets in." "Roger that, LT," Dutch said, grinning as he racked the slide of his concealed sidearm. Sarah turned to Greg. The arrogant resident was trembling. "Greg," Sarah said sharply. Yes." "Take Jessica and move all patients from the south wing into the interior corridors, away from the windows. Turn off the lights. Do it now." "But Dr. Thorne said—" Jessica stammered. "Thorne is gone," Sarah snapped. "I am the ranking officer on this deck. Move." They moved. Sarah wheeled Hayes back toward the elevator. "We're going to the 4th floor. Surgery. It has the thickest walls, limited access points, and backup generators." As they reached the 4th floor, the hospital hummed with a terrified energy. Sarah pushed Hayes into Trauma Room 3, the room farthest from the elevators. She began stripping the room of non-essentials. "You need a weapon," Hayes said, reaching for the holster on the pile of his bloody clothes that had been bagged up. It was empty. The paramedics had removed his Sig Sauer. "I have weapons," Sarah said, opening a drawer. She pulled out a scalpel, a roll of heavy surgical tape, and a pressurized canister of ethanol. Suddenly the hospital lights flickered and died. Total darkness. The backup generators kicked in a second later, bathing the hallways in a dim, eerie red emergency light. Click. The intercom system crackled. But it wasn't the hospital operator. "Commander Hayes," a distorted, digitized voice echoed through the speakers. "We know you're on the 4th floor. Send the encryption key down in the elevator, and we will leave the civilians alone. You have 5 minutes." Sarah looked at Hayes. "They're bluffing," Hayes said. "They'll kill everyone to cover their tracks." Sarah walked to the double doors of the surgical ward. She looked through the small glass window. The elevators at the far end of the hall dinged. The doors opened. 4 men stepped out. They wore black tactical gear, gas masks, and carried silenced submachine guns. They moved with fluid professional precision. Blackwell operators. They weren't here to negotiate. Sarah turned to the nurses' station, where Greg and Jessica were cowering behind the desk. "Get into the supply closet," Sarah whispered. "Lock the door. Do not open it unless you hear my voice." "What are you going to do?" Greg whispered, tears streaming down his face. "You don't have a gun." Sarah looked at the scalpel in her hand. She looked at the fire extinguisher on the wall. She looked at the shadows stretching down the hallway. "I'm going to triage the situation," Sarah said. She slipped into the darkness of the hallway, disappearing like a ghost. The hallway was silent, except for the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of the Blackwell operators' boots. They moved in a stack, checking rooms one by one. Kick, clear, move. Kick, clear, move. They were getting closer to trauma room 3. The lead operator signaled to stop. He saw something on the floor. It was a wheelchair overturned, a distraction. "Check right," the leader whispered into his comms. The second man peeled off to check the linen closet. He opened the door. Whoosh! A blast of white powder exploded into his face. Sarah had rigged a dry chemical fire extinguisher to the door handle with surgical tape. The operator gagged, blinded, flailing his arms. In the confusion, a shadow dropped from the ceiling panels above them. It was Sarah. She didn't land on the ground. She landed on the third man's back. Before he could raise his weapon, she jammed a syringe into the exposed gap of his neck armor. Succinylcholine, a paralytic agent used for intubation. The man dropped like a stone, his muscles seizing instantly. The leader spun around, firing blindly. Pft, pft, pft. Bullets chewed up the drywall, but Sarah was already moving. She rolled under a gurney, sliding across the polished floor like a baseball player stealing home. She came up behind the blinded man, who was still pawing at his eyes. She kicked the back of his knee, bringing him down, and snatched the MP5 submachine gun from his hands. "Contact rear!" the leader screamed. Sarah didn't hesitate. She wasn't a nurse anymore. She was Angel. She fired 2 controlled bursts. The leader took a hit to his vest and stumbled back, taking cover behind the nurse's station desk. The fourth man sprayed fire down the hall, forcing Sarah to dive into an open patient room. "She's armed," the leader yelled. "Flank her, frag out." A grenade skittered across the floor, stopping just outside Sarah's door. Sarah saw it. She didn't have time to run. She grabbed a heavy, lead-lined apron used for X-ray protection that was hanging on the door hook. She threw it over the grenade and dove behind the solid oak bed frame. Boom! The explosion shook the floor. The lead apron absorbed most of the shrapnel, but the concussion wave rattled Sarah's teeth and made her ears ring. Dust and smoke filled the corridor. "Move up! She's stunned!" The 2 remaining operators advanced through the smoke. Sarah was dazed. Her vision swam. Blood trickled from her nose. She checked the MP5. Jammed from the impact. Useless. She looked around the room. An oxygen tank. A defibrillator. She grabbed the defibrillator paddles and hit the charge button. "Whine. Clear left," a voice said right outside the door. A black boot stepped into the room. Sarah didn't wait. She lunged. She didn't aim for the man. She aimed for his weapon. She batted the barrel aside with her left hand, screaming as the hot suppressor burned her palm. With her right hand, she slammed the defibrillator paddle against the man's chest, right over his heart. "Clear!" Sarah yelled. Zap! 360 joules of electricity surged through the operator. His body went rigid. His finger clamped down on the trigger, sending a spray of bullets into the ceiling before he collapsed, convulsing. One man left, the leader. Sarah grabbed the fallen man's pistol, a Glock 19. She rolled onto her back, aiming at the door. But no one came in. Silence. "You're good," the leader's voice called out from the hallway. "For a nurse." "I'm not a nurse," Sarah called back, her voice steady, despite the pain in her hand. "I know," the voice said. "Angel, we read your file. Pity. You could have worked for us. I don't work for traitors. Then you die." A metal canister rolled into the room. Not a frag grenade. Flashbang. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut and covered her ears. Bang! Even with her eyes closed, the light was blinding. Her ears screamed. She was disoriented. The leader stormed the room. He saw her on the floor. He raised his rifle to her head. "Goodbye, Angel." Click. The hammer fell on an empty chamber. He had fired his last rounds at the ceiling during the confusion with his partner. The leader cursed and reached for his sidearm. But the half-second delay was all Sarah needed. She didn't shoot him. She swept his legs. He hit the ground, hard. Sarah was on top of him instantly. It was a brawl, now brutal close-quarters combat. He was stronger, heavier. He punched her in the face, splitting her lip. She took the hit and head-butted him her forehead, smashing into his nose. He roared and grabbed her throat, squeezing. Black spots danced in Sarah's vision. She couldn't breathe. Her hand scrabbled on the floor. She felt cold metal. A pair of trauma shears she had dropped earlier. With her last ounce of strength, she drove the shears down into the weak point of his tactical vest, the shoulder strap connection. He screamed and released her. Sarah rolled away, gasping for air. She grabbed the Glock she had dropped. The leader stumbled to his feet, pulling a knife. "Stay down," Sarah warned. He lunged. Bang, bang. 2 shots to the chest. The leader fell backward, crashing into a cart of sterile gauze. Silence returned to the 4th floor. Sarah sat there for a moment, panting, blood dripping from her nose and lip. Her scrub top was torn, revealing the old scars on her arms. "Is it over?" Sarah spun around, gun raised. It was Greg. He was peeking out of the supply closet, his face pale as a sheet. He looked at the bodies of the highly trained Vought mercenaries scattered in the hallway. He looked at the burnt mark on the wall from the grenade. And then he looked at Sarah. She was covered in dust, blood, and sheetrock. She looked terrifying. She looked magnificent. "Check the stairwell, Greg," Sarah said, standing up and wiping the blood from her mouth. "And get me a suture kit. I think I popped a stitch." Greg nodded frantically. "Yes, ma'am. Right away, ma'am." Sarah limped toward Trauma Room 3. She opened the door. Commander Hayes was sitting up, holding a scalpel ready to fight. He saw Sarah and relaxed. "Status?" Hayes asked. "Floor secure," Sarah said, leaning against the door frame. 4 hostiles down, but they'll send a second wave. We need to move." "We can't," Hayes said, nodding toward the window. Sarah looked out. Down in the parking lot, 3 black SUVs had pulled up. More men were pouring out, heavily armed men. And a helicopter was approaching from the south, not a medevac, but a blacked-out attack chopper. "That's the extraction team," Hayes said grimly. "Or the cleanup crew." Sarah checked the magazine in the Glock. 7 rounds. "Dutch," she radioed on the headset she had taken from the dead leader. "Pinned down in the lobby. LT." Dutch's voice came back, accompanied by the sound of heavy gunfire. "We're taking heavy heat. Can't get to you." Sarah looked at Hayes. They were trapped on the 4th floor. No way down. No way out. "Looks like we have to do this the hard way," Sarah said. "What's the hard way?" Hayes asked. Sarah looked at the oxygen tanks lining the wall. She looked at the approaching helicopter. A crazy, desperate plan formed in her mind. "We're going to the roof," Sarah said. "To surrender." "No." Sarah's eyes flashed with cold determination. "To take their ride." The stairwell to the roof was a vertical tunnel of concrete and darkness. Sarah didn't push the wheelchair. The stairs made that impossible. Instead, she had Commander Hayes's arm draped over her shoulder, her body acting as a crutch for his shattered frame. Every step was a battle against gravity and pain. "Leave me," Hayes gritted out, sweat stinging his eyes. "You can make it to the perimeter." "Negative," Sarah panted, her legs burning. "We leave together or we don't leave." They burst through the heavy steel fire door and onto the roof. The world exploded into noise and wind. A sleek, matte black MH-6 Little Bird helicopter was hovering just feet above the helipad, its rotors whipping the rain into a frenzy. The downdraft was immense, tearing at Sarah's scrubs. 4 men were fast roping down from the skids, the cleaners. They hit the deck with heavy thuds, weapons raised. Sarah dragged Hayes behind a massive HVAC ventilation unit, just as bullets sparked against the metal casing. "Ping, ping, ping!" "They have us pinned!" Hayes yelled over the roar of the rotors. Sarah looked at the oxygen tank she had dragged up with them. It was a crazy gamble, a 1 in a million shot. But she was out of options. "Cover your ears!" Sarah screamed. She didn't aim at the men. She aimed at the valve of the pressurized oxygen cylinder lying on the concrete between them and the enemy. She leveled the Glock. She took a breath, finding the stillness in the chaos. Bang! The bullet sheared the valve off the tank. The cylinder didn't just explode, it became a missile. With a shrieking hiss of escaping gas, the heavy steel tank launched itself forward with terrifying velocity. It smashed into the legs of the lead mercenary, shattering bone before careening into the tail rotor of the hovering helicopter. Crunch! The helicopter screamed a mechanical shriek of tearing metal. The tail rotor disintegrated. The pilot lost yaw control. The bird began to spin violently, the torque whipping it around. The pilot fought the stick, but physics was unforgiving. The helicopter slewed sideways, its skids clipping the edge of the roof, and crashed hard onto the helipad, rolling onto its side. The rotors shattered, sending shrapnel flying like deadly confetti. The mercenaries on the roof were knocked flat by the impact. "Move, now!" Sarah roared. She hauled Hayes up. They didn't run away from the crash. They ran toward it. The pilot was slumped over the controls, unconscious. Fuel was leaking. The engine was whining, trying to tear itself apart. Sarah yanked the pilot's door open, unbuckled him, and dragged him out onto the wet concrete. She shoved Hayes into the co-pilot's seat. "Can you fly?" Hayes shouted, strapping in. "I'm a para-rescue jumper," Sarah yelled, jumping into the pilot's seat. "We know enough to get home." She scanned the console. It was a digital glass cockpit complex military grade. Warning lights were flashing red. Rotor RPM low. Hydraulic failure. Come on, Sarah whispered, flipping switches with practiced speed. She killed the auto throttle and engaged the manual override. Outside, the surviving mercenaries were getting to their feet. They raised their rifles. Bullets shattered the windshield. Glass sprayed into the cockpit. Sarah grabbed the cyclic stick and ripped the collective up. The helicopter groaned, shuddered, and lifted. It was ugly. It lurched to the left, scraping the concrete sparks flying. But it was airborne. Sarah kicked the pedal, swinging the nose around. She didn't fly away immediately. She dipped the nose, buzzing the mercenaries, forcing them to dive for cover. "Dutch!" Sarah screamed into the headset. "Roof is clear. We have air transport. Get to the roof." "Negative, Angel." Dutch's voice crackled, sounding strained. "We're cut off. Elevators are disabled. We're holding the lobby, but we're out of ammo." Sarah looked at the fuel gauge. Low. She looked at Hayes. He was fading again, the G-force taking its toll. She made a choice. "Hold on," Sarah said. She pushed the stick forward. The damaged helicopter dove off the side of the building. For a terrifying second, they were free-falling toward the parking lot. Then Sarah pulled up at the last second, leveling out just 50 feet above the ground. She hovered right in front of the hospital's main glass entrance, the lobby where the battle was raging. Inside, Dutch and his team were pinned behind the reception desk. Blackwell operators were advancing. Sarah didn't have guns on the chopper. The crash had jammed the miniguns. But she had something else. "Brace!" Sarah spun the helicopter around, aiming the engine exhaust and the massive downdraft directly into the shattered lobby doors. The force of the rotor wash was like a hurricane. It blasted into the lobby, sending furniture glass and Blackwell operators flying backward. The dust and debris created a blinding go! Sarah screamed into the radio. Dutch saw the opening. He grabbed his wounded teammate. "Move to the evac zone, the parking lot." The operators sprinted out of the lobby, using the helicopter as a shield. They scrambled into the back of the hovering bird, hauling themselves onto the skids. "We're clear." "Punch it," Dutch yelled. Sarah pulled the collective. The helicopter screamed one last time and surged upward, climbing into the rainy night sky, leaving the chaos of St. Jude's Hospital behind them. Below them, flashing lights of police and FBI units were finally swarming the grounds. The cavalry had arrived, but they were 10 minutes too late. If it hadn't been for the nurse with the shaking hands, everyone would be dead. The private airfield in Virginia was quiet. The sun was setting, casting long orange shadows across the tarmac. Sarah stood by the chain-link fence, wearing civilian clothes, jeans, and a leather jacket. Her arm was in a sling, and she had a butterfly bandage over her eye. A black government sedan pulled up. Dutch got out first, looking clean-shaven and wearing a dress uniform. He opened the back door. Commander Hayes stepped out. He was on crutches, but he was standing. He wore his full dress whites, the gold trident of a Navy SEAL gleaming on his chest. He walked over to Sarah. "They told me you declined the medal," Hayes said softly. Sarah shrugged, looking at the runway. "I didn't do it for a medal. I just wanted to do my job." "You did a hell of a lot more than that," Hayes said. "Blackwell has been dismantled. The files you secured. They took down 3 corrupt senators and half the defense board. You cleaned house, Angel." "I'm retired commander," Sarah said. "Or I was supposed to be." Hayes reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small velvet box. "The Navy can't officially recognize what happened at that hospital," Hayes said. "But the Brotherhood can." He opened the box. Inside wasn't a medal. It was a pin, a small golden angel wing. The guys from the squadron voted. Hayes smiled. You're not Angel anymore. Call sign is Valkyrie, because you choose who lives and who dies. Sarah took the pin. She felt a lump in her throat. What about the hospital? Sarah asked. Dr. Thorne. Dutch laughed, stepping forward. Thorne, he's currently facing federal charges for medical negligence and fraud. And get this, Administrator Sterling resigned. The board appointed a new chief of nursing. Who? Jessica, Dutch, grinned. She grew a backbone that night. She told the FBI everything. Sarah smiled. It was a real smile this time. So, Hayes said, the job offer still stands. We need a medic for a new task force. No red tape, no administrators. Just the mission. Sarah looked at her hands. They weren't shaking anymore. She looked at Hayes, then at the horizon. When do we start? Back at St. Jude's, the break room was quiet. A new nurse was restocking the shelves. Greg, the resident, walked in. He looked different, humbled. He saw the new nurse struggling with a heavy box. In the past, he would have ignored her. He would have laughed. Here, Greg said, stepping forward. Let me get that for you. Thanks, Doctor. The nurse smiled. Greg looked at the empty locker in the corner, the one that used to belong to Sarah. Someone had taped a small printed picture to it. It was a blurry photo from a security camera showing a woman standing amidst the smoke holding a defibrillator paddle like a shield. Underneath it, someone had written one word in Sharpie, respect. Greg tapped the photo, then turned back to the room. Carry on, he said. The legend of the nurse who was a soldier would never leave those halls, and the doctors never laughed at a new hire again. This story isn't just about combat. It's about the invisible battles people fight every day. Sarah Mitchell represents the thousands of veterans who walk among us, carrying skills and burdens we can't see. The doctors judged her by her silence, mistaking trauma for weakness and humility for incompetence. In a world obsessed with status and ego, Sarah reminds us that true strength doesn't need to announce itself. It just steps up when the fire starts. It's a reminder to never underestimate the quiet ones, because the person mopping the floor might be the only one capable of saving your life. If this story gave you chills, or if you believe that our veterans deserve more respect than they get, hit that like button right now. It helps us share these stories with the world. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. We have a new saga coming next week about a homeless man who turned out to be a chess grandmaster. You don't want to miss it. Comment Valkyrie below if you made it to the end. Thanks for watching.